What makes some ToK essay titles more difficult than others? And conversely, what makes some titles easier than others? Welcome to ToK Today. I'm Daniel. So the May 2023 essay titles are out, and some of us implicitly think that we know that some of the essay titles are more difficult than others, and conversely, some of them are easier than others. I thought that I would make this video to try to share some of that implicit knowledge. Now, right up at the front of the video, it's important to say that the IB own the copyright to the prescribed titles for the essay titles, and rightly so, they don't like us sharing those titles in a public forum. Therefore, the titles I'm going to talk about today are slightly changed so that we don't infringe the IB copyright. They're our friends and we want to work with them. And the essay titles I'm going to talk about are past essay titles rather than the May 23 essay titles. If you want information about the May 23 essay titles, I have a heap load of videos coming up on those soon. Second thing, before I get started, I feel I need to get out of the way the relativist bit of this. Here's the relativist bit. Of course, which essay title the student finds difficult will vary by the student. Some students may find one title more difficult, whilst other students find another title more difficult. How difficult it is to support a particular student with a particular question will vary by student, by teacher. It's sort of relative. Whether the more popular answers are marked more stringently by IB examiners will vary by examiner and by question. It's relative, alright? So I accept there's a lot of relativist knowledge in this video, right? Okay, with the relativist bit out of the way, let's get to the meat of the video. So, 6 factors that make essay titles more difficult or more easy. The first factor is closed or open-ended questions. Alright, we know that all of the questions are supposed to be answered in an open-ended way. They're all meant to be open-ended. But the way that they're written, some of them are more closed-ended than open-ended. So let me just give you an example. I go to my notes. May 2022, question number 3. Is there a solid justification for regarding knowledge in area of knowledge 1 more highly than area of knowledge 2? Okay, so in this case, the student can start with, yes, there is a solid justification, or no, there isn't a solid justification. As a starting point, it's quite defined, okay? So the IB have given us a fairly closed-ended question. They say, is there a solid justification for this? It's quite closed-ended, and it gives the student a good basis from which to start answering the question. As such, I would classify this as being an easier question. Now, the most closed-ended prescribed titles contain absolute statements, okay, something we need to be aware of. So, an example of this is from November 2021, and there is nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. There's a quote from Arthur Conan Doyle, alright? And this is an absolute statement. There's nothing more deceptive, nothing at all. Well, that gives the students a really, really clear start from where to write from, which is, well, yeah, there are some things that are more deceptive, and here we go, it might be these things. Or Conan Doyle is arguing this because, and it gives us a clear basis from which to start the arguments. The closed or open-ended questions, the more closed-ended the question, the easier I think it is to start to answer for the student. So, second factor, some essay titles contain assumptions. Virtually all of them contain assumptions. Some of them contain multiple assumptions. Some of them contain just explicit assumptions, but some of them contain implicit assumptions as well. And some of them contain both explicit and implicit assumptions. This example comes from May 2020. Does it matter that your personal circumstances influence how seriously your knowledge is considered or taken? Now, there's an assumption here that your personal circumstances do affect how seriously your knowledge is considered. And that's quite an explicit assumption. Okay, let's look at an implicit assumption. And this example comes from November 2021. And the question is, if all knowledge is provisional, then when can we have confidence in what we claim to know? And the implicit assumption here is that we ever have confidence in what we claim to know. Yeah? Let's look at an example where there are both implicit and explicit assumptions. So this is from November 2021, and the question is, why is it so difficult to show a clear line between accepted knowledge and disputed knowledge within a discipline. Okay, so there are explicit and implicit assumptions in this question. The explicit assumption is that that it is difficult to show a clear line, identify a clear line between accepted and disputed knowledge. Another explicit assumption is that there is both disputed and accepted knowledge within a discipline. The implicit assumption is that we might want to identify this line. We may not want to. We may not need to. The thing about assumptions is students have to decide which assumptions they're going to accept and which assumptions they're going to challenge. And they have to decide whether they're going to tell the examiner or not what they're accepting and what they're challenging. And they only have 1,600 words to do this in. And they have to answer the question as well. So I recommend to my students two things. First of all, if you can tell the examiner which assumptions you're accepting and which ones you're rejecting, then do so. If you've got the words to do it, then do that. Because it tells the examiner that you have a sort of critical understanding of the prescribed title. Secondly, if you can tell the examiner which ones you're accepting and which ones you're rejecting or challenging as part of your answer, then you're really on the way to building a great ToK essay answer. Okay? So the challenging of the assumption itself becomes the answer to the question, and that's going to be evaluative, analytical. It's going to get you into those higher mark bands. It's important that when you're challenging or accepting assumptions, that you don't stray too far away from the prescribed title, that you keep focused on the prescribed title, because that's the overriding question which the student has to answer. So I've got more detail about this in the blog, link in the video description below. If you want to see more worked examples of how you can stay on with the prescribed title, or how you might move away from the prescribed title and get into danger zone and bring yourself back. If you want to see worked examples of that, click over to the blog toktoday.com, and I've got some worked examples on there. Okay, third factor, which makes some ToK essay questions more difficult than other questions, which is the issue of quotes. Some of the essay titles, prescribed titles, have quotes in them from famous and important people. Like in May 2022, we had a quote from Maya Angelou. A quote from an estimable person doesn't necessarily make the essay title any more difficult. However, in my experience, I have found that for some students, the person whose quote it comes from can sort of get in the way of the knowledge question. It can sort of shroud the knowledge question in some way. And sometimes students sort of set off down the route of finding out about the person who made the quote. To try to get a better understanding of the quote, they sort of go into the biography of the person who's quoted, trying to get some background history on that person, seeing if the life of that person and their work can in any way inform the essay. In my experience, in my opinion, certainly as from being an examiner, the ideas and the works of the person quoted are virtually never relevant to the actual essay itself. Okay? And you don't need to write about the person who is quoted to get high marks in the essay. They are using the quote to draw out a knowledge question or a knowledge issue. And the quote is just a vehicle for that. So if you answer that question about Maya Angelou, you don't have to write about Maya Angelou. You don't have to know anything about her life works. You don't have to know anything about what she believed. And you can still get super high marks by not mentioning her. And equally, some students who are really good at ToK they could use some of the life works of the person who's quoted, such as Maya Angelou, and they could craft an excellent essay around that. Where we run into trouble are students who find ToK more challenging, they find it more difficult, a bit mysterious, and they start to use some of the biography of the person or their life works in the essay, and it's not directly relevant to the knowledge question that's being, that the IB are trying to get you to address. So, on the whole, I would say that essay titles with a quote can sometimes be more difficult for students who find ToK more challenging. Equally, I guess you could say that they give more direction and therefore they might be easier. So what are you saying, Daniel? Move on, that's what I'm saying. Move on to factor number 4. So factor number 4 are definitions. Sometimes I think that the ToK essay is all about definitions. That's what the essay is writing definitions. And it's really important that students develop their own definitions of the concepts and the key terms that are there in the prescribed title. Please don't use a dictionary. The dictionary doesn't help, like a sort of normal Oxford educational dictionary, because the definitions that you're going to have to develop, not only do they have to be ToK specific, but they have to be specific for this particular essay. So they are much deeper and more sort of focused on this essay than any definition that you're going to find on the internet. Okay? And defining the key term might actually be the essay itself. Let's have a look at a couple of things. So first of all, you'll usually find one of the 12 ToK concepts in the essay title, at least one of the 12 ToK concepts in the essay title. They should be fairly easy for you to define as a ToK student because you've done the ToK course. So, a couple of examples. From May 2022, essay title number 5, it should have been quite easy for students to define interpretation in the arts. Okay, you'll have studied the concept of interpretation, you'll have studied some aspects of AOK the arts, and you're able to put those things together and you should be able to come up with a pretty good definition of that. However, also from May 2022, the concept of culture was present in question 1. Culture, not super easy to define, but not totally esoteric. But the question was about culture within AOK maths, AOK mathematics. And that's going to be more challenging to define, because I wonder how many people studied the culture of mathematics when they were looking at the concept of culture. Of course, maths has a culture, as every discipline has a culture. But that would have been a big part of writing that essay, would have been to define what we mean by culture in AOK maths. Cool, I would have enjoyed that. Definitions can become more challenging when we have to define key terms or concepts which aren't part of the ToK 12 concepts. There are other concepts which are important that the IB examiners have brought in, which reminds me of the video I made a couple of days ago on knowledge issues and why they're still important, you see. So we're not totally just constrained within those 12 concepts, but there are lots of other concepts which may come in. Let's look at some examples. Essay title number 4 from May 2022 had the concept of stories right at the centre of it. And students would have to define what was meant by a story in history and define what was meant by a story in the human sciences. And I remember having a lot of interesting discussions with my students on, well, what do you think is meant by a story in human sciences? Really interesting stuff. Essay number 4 from November 2022, the concept of indisputable. They would have had to define the concept of indisputable, indisputability, indisputableness. when you come across a concept which isn't part of the 12 ToK concepts, I often find that the students who find ToK more difficult are the ones who reach straight for a dictionary and try to come up with a dictionary definition for that concept, and that's really where things start to fall apart. Because, as I said earlier, the definition that you come up with has to be specific for that essay and for that knowledge question. So, titles that have fewer concepts in them and only have ToK 12 concepts in them are easier to do than titles that have more concepts in them and have concepts which are non-ToK 12 concepts, if you get my meaning. Let us move on to factor number 5. Okay, factor number 5 is a bit like the assumptions factor in its claims, all right? Knowledge claims. All of the prescribed titles have at least one knowledge claim in them. Some have 2 knowledge claims in them, and some may even have 3 knowledge claims in them. And your job as a ToK student is to pick apart the knowledge claim that's in the title, to analyse the knowledge claim that's in the title. Now, if there are 2 knowledge claims in the title, or even 3, then you have more of a job to do. Obviously, you either tackle them all, but you still only have 1,600 words to do it in, or you discard some of them and just ignore 1 or 2 knowledge claims, which is a bit risky. So quite simply, it's easier to do an essay title that only has 1 knowledge claim in it than an essay title that has 2 or 3 knowledge claims in it. Let me give you some examples. Essay number 5 from November 2020, the claim is reliable knowledge can lack certainty. The claim is reliable knowledge can lack certainty. Really straightforward, really direct, 1 knowledge claim. The students can then start to look at arguments that reliable knowledge does lack certainty, or arguments that reliable knowledge may not lack certainty. Let's have a look at an essay that has multiple knowledge claims. And if you'll excuse me, I'm going to read it because it's a little bit complicated to remember. So this is essay number 6 from November 22. If artists have freedom to interpret the past in ways that are denied to historians, is this a benefit or a barrier to our understanding of the past? Discussed with reference to the arts and history. Okay. I've slightly changed that so I don't get in the way of copyright. Here we have lots of claims. If artists have freedom to interpret the past in ways that are denied to historians, there's a claim there that artists do have freedom to interpret the past in ways that historians don't. So there's a second claim there that historians are limited in the ways that they can interpret the past. And then there's a claim that this may either be a benefit or a barrier to the understanding of the past. It's a little bit like assumptions. In this case, the claim has to be dealt with alongside the question itself. There's a claim that if artists do have blah-de-blah-de-blah, the propositional claim, and then there's the question that it may be a barrier or a benefit. You have 2 things happening. I'd be like, well, do I deal with this, the artists and the historians and the interpretation of the past, or do I deal with the benefits and the barriers? Of course, what you're meant to do is you're meant to deal with both of them together as one essay question. My argument would be that this makes it a slightly more difficult question. But of course, let's remember the relativism bit at the beginning. It really depends upon the student and the individual and the essay and the teacher and context and the day of the week and the way the wind's blowing and the examiners who mark your questions and how blue the sea is, how blue the sky is, and how green the grass is. On we go to the final factor, number 6, which is freedom of area of knowledge. Until recently, most of the essay questions used to give you completely free rein over which area of knowledge you wanted to address in your response. So it would say something like, the essay question would be something like, is this better than this? Discuss with reference to 2 areas of knowledge. And you could just pick any areas of knowledge that you wanted. As long as you did 2 and only 2, you would be fine. Okay? Now, recently, they've started to name the areas of knowledge that they want you to address much more pointedly. So they'll say, discuss this with reference to human sciences and history, or discuss this with reference to natural sciences and the arts. So they're directing you as to which areas of knowledge. I think for May 22, it was 5 out of 6 titles were directing people. Now, I think it's better when you are directed to an area of knowledge. I think it makes things easier if you're directed to an area of knowledge. And the reason being for this is that the essay titles are written very carefully by the IB examiners. They consider the wording of that title very carefully. And every word in that title is trying to lead you to a sort of a set of knowledge questions and a knowledge debate. Okay? There might be one key knowledge debate or a number of knowledge debates, but they're leading you to a particular debate. Usually they're actually classic philosophy debates, but that's another video. And when they are specifying the area of knowledge, when they're directing you to an area of knowledge, it gives you a big hint as to the debate that they want you to have. Okay? Whereas when they just leave it open, it's much easier to miss the point. It's much easier to miss the debate that they're trying to get you to have. So, if they're asking you to compare history with human sciences, then it's probably quite safe to assume that they are interested in the difference between history being explanations based on past documents, whereas human sciences being explanations based upon research in current times with real life humans today. Actual experimental research today rather than interpretations of documents from the past. If they're asking you to compare maths and the arts, then it's probably safe to assume they're sort of interested in sets of rules. The arts has some sets of rules which are sort of freer and more open for interpretation, and maths has more sets of rules which are narrower and not so open to interpretation at all. And so on and so on, we could carry on. The basic point here being that, in my opinion, it is easier to do essay titles which have directed at least one area of knowledge or both areas of knowledge than it is to do essay titles which leave you completely free to choose what you would like to do. Freedom is not a good thing. There's lots more information on this on the blog, which I'll put in the video description below, where I've got worked examples and annotated examples and all of that stuff, and more explanation as to why certain questions are easier than others. But for me to go through all of that here on this video would make the video ridiculously long, and you'd all be switching off before the end, which isn't good for the YouTube algorithm. Okay, so they're the 6 factors. Before I go, I'd just like to draw your attention to a couple of other things which I think can make ToK Essays a bit more difficult, okay? The first one is where there's no explicit link to any area of knowledge, or sort of no directive link to ToK itself. So typically there might just be a claim, a quote, and then a sort of discuss this. And you can't really get where the ToK is meant to be coming from. I'll just give you a couple of examples. So this is essay number 2 for November 2021. It is, knowledge gained through direct experience is powerful but can be problematic. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Now, to me, it's obvious that it's ToK. But to some students, and especially students who struggle more with ToK, the ToK may not be obvious there, and it would be quite easy to write an anecdotal essay about personal experience and knowledge. They don't want an anecdotal essay about personal experience and knowledge. What they want is they want personal experience located within a process of knowledge construction in two AOKs and comparing those two AOKs. So they might compare the arts with maths, for example. Personal experience has more, arguably has a bigger role in the arts in knowledge construction than it does in maths. But it's quite easy to just lose focus with that essay title. Let's look at another essay title. So this title also comes from November. It's November 2020. It's November, students. You get all the interesting essay titles. This one goes, too much of our knowledge revolves around ourselves, as if we are the most important thing in the universe. And that's a quote from Carlo Rovelli. And then it says, why could this be problematic? Again, it's a question which is about the individual, seems to be about the individual, and says, is this a problem? Now I can see that the essay is ToK and they're actually asking you again about knowledge construction through the knowledge framework in the areas of knowledge, right? But it'd be very easy to write an essay which is about whether it's a problem that we experience our world in the way that we do, and forget the ToK. So just be a little wary if there aren't sort of direct instructions to areas of knowledge or the knowledge framework. It might make the essay slightly more difficult. Okay, the final factor, which I think can make essays a bit more challenging, is the word truth, the word truth. I used to have a rule where I said to my students, if you're going to use the word truth, if you're going to use it either in your essay or just in class, then you better have a really good definition for that word, okay? I don't want it used interchangeably with the word fact, right? Because it might not be the same thing. I don't think it is the same thing. And you have to have a good, robust definition if you're going to use the word truth. Generally, don't use the word truth, okay? But then I came up with a new ToK study guide in 2020, and it had 12 concepts, and one of those concepts was truth. So now we can't ignore the word truth. Which presents me with a bit of a problem, because now I have to teach about truth. It's one of the 12 concepts, one of the big things, and obviously it's super important truth, but it's one of the harder concepts to sort of deal with, I think, both as a ToK student and as a ToK teacher. And I'm just writing some blog posts on truth with some lessons on truth, and I've just written a lesson starter on truth, which will be going up on the ToK Today website soon. So you can't avoid truth, but if it's there in the essay title, think to yourself, do I truthfully want to come up with some really good, strong definitions of this slightly problematic word? Okay, on that note, this has been a longer video than I hoped for. Thank you very much for watching to the end. I hope that you found it useful, and if you did, please give me a like. And if you want more of this, then I would be so happy if you would give me a subscribe. Share this video with your friends. If you found it useful, they might find it useful as well. And I hope to see you in the next video. Stay ToK-tastic. Bye for now.